Johan, occupation before registration. Does this mean I am now a tenant and I can start renovating my new property that I moved in? What is my rights as a buyer or seller that's staying longer in the property?
Amore, that's a very good question. I think the illusion is created that as soon as I occupy a premises that I am fully entitled to renovations as well as additions to the property and the like. But that is unfortunately not the case. In many instances, the contract regulates the situation in the event of occupation, but in the absence, the practice is normally followed. And the practice is that no renovations or amendments or additions to the property can take place prior to date of registration unless you have a written consent from the specific owner. We've got to remember that you basically get into the shoes of a tenant as soon as you take occupation of the property and you pay occupational rent. Therefore, it doesn't entitle you to much more than a tenant would have in the event of an occupation in terms of a rental agreement. So it's of the utmost importance that if you as a prospective purchaser intend to do certain renovations, that you disclose those renovations to the owner or the seller, and that he provides you with a written consent to proceed, because you might be out of pocket in the event where something might go wrong with the transaction and end up to lose out on all the improvement costs that you've incurred without his consent.
Yeah, that's very true. Because one of the things that can happen in a transaction is one of the people that are involved in this contract can die. And then this becomes a late estate if that was a seller. And that means that this can now, depending on that will, have severe impact on your renovations and moving in or out of that property because you're still not the legal owner.
No, it has an absolute devastating effect, especially, like I said, in those instances where something goes wrong with the transaction, registration is postponed. We have to remember that some improvements for prospective purchasers might not be an improvement for the seller. So if you would have to revert the transaction back to where all the parties were prior to entering into the agreement, it might be irreversible. So in that regard, I think that, especially as a tip to the sellers, I would really restrict any consent granted to purchasers for purposes of renovations to the bare minimum. I mean, I'm not talking about a coat of paint. I'm talking about structural changes or whatever the case may be. It could have an irreversible effect at the end of the day. And many of the purchasers think that if they do those renovations, they are automatically entitled to remuneration for those specific additions and renovations, which is not the case. If those renovations are done, even with the consent of the seller, you do it at your sole risk and you do it at your sole expense. So it is not to say that if the transaction would not proceed or may be cancelled, that I would automatically be entitled to those remuneration costs. So there's an inherent risk for the purchaser as well, doing those renovations, even if he has the necessary consent.
So in summary, you would say, you are not the legal owner yet. Don't treat the property as if you own it yet. Wait until registration.
100%.
Thank you, Johan, for your time.
My pleasure.